So in our last lecture, we were taking a look at trying to understand, okay, what's politics, what's power, and what are the things, and what is science, and what are the things that science can and can't do. And we said that politics is who gets what, when, and how. We said that power is about getting people to do things they weren't already so inclined to do. And we said science was this interaction between empirical observation and rational thought that allowed us to make falsifiable predictions about the world, but can't help us in the production of normative claims, which are not possible by science. Now here we want to get to the first big concept that's going to be informing the American political system, right? So far we've had some setup, and we have a little bit more setup left to do. Because what we need to take a look at, to understand the American political system, we have to understand the things that informed it. And one of the first things that informed it is going to be this question of the state. Now, what's a state? Now, when we're talking about states here, we do not mean things like Florida and Ohio or, pick whatever else it is. No. Those are actually just anachronistically named. What we're talking about are what is the thing that governs specific territory, that has power, right? Why is it that a police officer can pull you over and give you a ticket? Why can the IRS fine you? That is this thing. That's the institution that we're getting at here. That's what we're talking about when we talk about a state. And a very famous political sociologist, his name is Max Weber. Yes, I know that's a W, but he is German, and so you pronounce the W as a V, right? So he is Weber, Max Weber, right? And he writes in the work Politics as a Vocation, which is about a lot of things, but in addition, defining what a state is. And he gives the classic definition of a state. And he says that a state is a human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory, right? And what he means is that the state is the thing that we say can rightfully shoot you, can rightfully lock you away in prison, can rightfully tax you, can do all of these kinds of things to you, right? Most people are not going to question that the police officer can pull you over and shoot you if you attempt to resist arrest, or can throw you into jail for long periods of time, or the IRS can come and take money from you. We don't call those illegitimate. We think of that generally as being, okay for a variety of reasons that we're not going to try to get in here. But here's the problem. Why? Remember, I told you there'd be a lot of questions in this class. Why do we allow states to do this? What makes it legitimate for a state to behave in a way that we wouldn't allow individuals or other kinds of groups to behave? And answering that question is actually going to be a central one. And then let's rephrase it. How do we justify state coercion? And answering this question will help us understand how we lead to the Constitution that we have. Because there are actually three very distinct periods of time that are going to give slightly different answers for this. And each of these are going to have theorists and political theorists answering this normative question, right? It's not a scientific one yet, a normative question. And their answers are going to inform the individuals who will shape how our system should, they thought, work. And we're going to break this up in three time periods. We're going to take a look at the classical theorists, we're going to take a look at Enlightenment theorists, and then finally we're going to take a look at modern theorists. But in this first video, we're just going to focus here on the classical theorists, and we'll take on Enlightenment and modern in their own sections. So, the classical theorists include Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. But in this class, we will be, of course, focusing on Plato and Aristotle, and that's because Socrates, we don't actually have any of his works. They're lost. Or at least had not, in fact, we're not even positive necessarily if he had to write something. There's debate about this. But anyway, the interesting point, though, is that how we know about him primarily is through his most famous student, Plato. So Socrates and Plato, there's a lot of overlap here. So we'll take a look at Plato, and then we'll look at Plato's most famous student, Aristotle, and see how they answer this question of the state. How do you justify government coercion? And we'll take a look at Plato first. Plato lives from 427 to 347 BC, and he's going to write in a very unique time. He's going to grow up during the Peloponnesian War, which will eventually, and that's a war that takes place in the area that we now think of as Greece, between Athens, one city-state, and Sparta, another city-state. And this is the Peloponnesian War, and it will greatly influence Plato and Socrates. Plato's main work is going to be a book called The Republic. It's actually mammoth, and the whole purpose is to lay out what is a just state, our exact question that we're attempting to take on. And The Republic is written in a method that you're probably not familiar with. It's a dialogue, and we don't have this kind of genre anymore. But the closest thing that we have would be a play, right? So you have one set of characters, and there's actually like people talking, and it looks kind of like stage direction in a way, because Socrates will say this: the main character in all of Plato's works is always a guy named Socrates, his professor, if you will. And the Republic is about trying to answer what's a just state, and it's actually also about trying to answer what's just for an individual. But at the very beginning of the book, Plato says, well, if it's easier to understand wings on a bird than it is on a fly, then surely it's easier to understand justice in a state, which is a very big thing, rather than an individual. So let's start with the big thing and move to the little thing. And he actually spends the rest of the time talking about a state. And what Plato says is that the way we should be ruled are by enlightened philosopher kings. Philosophers should be the rulers, the nearly dictatorial rulers. But there's a problem, and he says is that people don't want philosopher kings. We have a problem. And so the only way to get around this is to somehow not convince, but to kind of lie to people to get this to happen. And why we have to do all of this is one of the greatest allegories of all time, and it's called the allegory of the cave. So picture for a moment, as our happy young fellows here are, that you are a prisoner in a cave, and your whole existence you've been chained to the wall. But behind you there is always raging by the guards a giant flame, a big bonfire, if you will. And so their whole existence, these slaves who have been chained here and these prisoners have been looking, and all they can see are the wall, and as you can see here, the shadows on the wall. And so their whole lives are understood and talked of in terms of shadows. So a house isn't a house, but it's a shadow, and a bird is actually a shadow. And so Socrates says, imagine that somebody comes along one day and cuts the chain of one of these prisoners, and for whatever reason sets him free. And so he immediately attempts to escape. He moves out. He comes up and up out of the shadows. And eventually this is what he sees. Oops. I am missing a page. Well, we'll just carry on anyway. But what he sees is a big blinding light. right? And that's the sun, right? And so he's coming up out of the cave, and it's overpowering him, and he can't see, and he kind of thinks like he's about to die, right? Because his eyes have never adjusted to true, daylight before, and so he's trying to deal with it, and he doesn't know what to do, but slowly and eventually he starts to realize he's not dying. His eyes begin to dilate, they begin to change, and he starts seeing the world as it is for the first time, right? And so he's running around, and he's looking over here. It's a tree, it's a real tree. And look, I can hear, there's the bird, and that's what a bird looks like. And what he realizes, what comes on to him after he's had a minute of pure and utter astonishment, is that his whole life has actually been spent in the shadows. It hasn't been real. And so Plato says, well, let's assume that this man heads back down. He descends back down to enlighten his fellow slaves. He goes back to the cave to tell them all about what he's seen. And so he gets back into the cave, and you would think, right, everybody's going to be excited. No, Plato says, they're not going to believe him. As a matter of fact, when he gets in there, the cave is going to seem dark and dank, and he's not going to easily see the shadows on the wall anymore because his eyes are used to the sunlight now. And so they dismiss him as an idiot and a fool. And Plato says that this sums up the paradox of a philosopher. The philosopher knows what's true, he knows what's right, but there's nothing he can do about it. And so what Plato says is, in order to get everyone to do what they ought to do, we need a government a state that will make philosophers kings, even when no one would want them to be kings, and to make the people who should be military people, the military people, even if no one wants them to be. In other words, justice is getting everybody to do their part, but no one will do it without the grand lie. And the grand lie for Plato is that we're actually going to pretend that there's a God, and we're going to pretend that God put in everybody different levels of soul. And so it's your color, it's your metal soul that determines what you should be. Gold people will be the philosopher kings, and silver, the merchants and the fighters, and so forth. And that this is actually a big lie. The philosophers will be in on it, but nobody else. Everybody else will believe that actually God has dictated it. And so coercion will be based on trying to get us to justice, which is only possible through a lie. Now, Plato's greatest student, Aristotle, who is going to live from 384 to 322 BC, is going to have a rather different view of this. Aristotle is going to be one of the first people to really focus on that empirical stuff that we talked about in our last lesson. He's going to say we should be looking at the world. And he says when we look at the world, we see a few important things. One, that politics, and this always makes my soul feel good, is the most important science you can study. No, it's not STEM, says Aristotle, right? It's studying politics, because we can't know what other kinds of things we should do until we know how we ought to be arranged as human creatures. And he says also by looking at the world, we can see that everyone needs a polis. And what he means by this is everybody is part of a government. Everybody is part of a city. Everybody is a part of a basic unit. We don't live alone. We can't live alone. And so we need to study politics, which is the interactions of the polis. So we haven't kept the word polis, or this basic political unit, in our English vocabulary, but we have taken its derivative, politics. So for Aristotle, what he says, we need to study the way people interact. We need to understand the interactions of the polis, the basic unit of government. We need to understand politics. And he says, let's look out in the world, categorize all the different kinds of governments, and then look at the good forms of each of those categories and the bad forms of each of those categories. And he says the reason we have to do this is because we all have to be social. Now, there might be some of you out there saying, but I don't have to be, I can go live in Alaska or whatnot. And Aristotle says no. He says this. It's a really important little quote. He says, quote, "Man is by nature a social animal. An individual who is unsocial naturally and not accidentally, is either beneath our notice or more than a human. Society is something that precedes the individual. Anyone who either cannot lead the common life or is so self-sufficient as to not need it, and therefore does not partake of society, is either a beast or a god. In short, what Aristotle is saying is that if you're an animal, you don't need government, you don't need a polis, and if you're God, you don't need a polis. But here's the problem: you are neither of these things, and therefore you do. And so we should understand the categories of it. And that's at least Aristotle's response, although we don't have to agree, I suppose. And he says the best way to take a look and understand this is we can look around and say that all different kinds of states have basically three possibilities. You can have a singular ruler, you can have a few rulers, or you can have many rulers. And that's really the only possibilities. And of each of these forms, he says, well, there are some that look out for the interest of society. And there are some that look out for their own, the ruler's, self-interest. Now, he says those that are looking out for society's interest, those are the good forms, and those who are looking out for their own interest, those are the bad forms, and that there's one for each of our categories. So a singular ruler who is interested in the people is a monarch, and the ones that are not are a tyrant, an aristocracy, an oligarchy, and a democracy, an okolarchy. Now, so far so good. He says that there's something else interesting about this. He says that there's actually kind of a decay model to this. Slowly but surely, the forms lead one into the next. Eventually, moving all the way around. He says, look, there's monarchs. But the problem is that a monarch, while he may be interested in his own good rule, who will be the next monarch? Probably his son. And who's to say that the son is going to be interested in society? As a matter of fact, he's going to grow up in a privileged, bizarre location in life. He's going to be like a celebrity. Can you imagine getting ruled by Paris Hilton? And his answer is they're going to be completely self-interested. It'll be tyranny. So slowly, the good monarch whose interests his people and his people love him will result in a tyrant. And so a few, the rich, worthy few, will emerge, overthrow the tyrant, and rule themselves. An aristocracy, which is a rule of the few, but a good rule of the few. But slowly the same kind of decay will happen until the aristocracy is no longer interested in the common man, the common person, and society's general interest. Rather, they'll be interested only in themselves. And then we'll have oligarchy. And the general population of men will be oppressed. And they'll eventually rise up and say, we can do better, and then you'll have rule of the many, democracy. Now here's where things get a tiny bit confusing. Democracy for Aristotle means really the rule by the landed, the landed ethnically correct people, i.e. men, for instance. But what will happen is eventually everybody wants part of the rule, not just the right kinds of individuals, and soon you'll have okolarchy, which is ruled by everyone, women, slaves, the whole works. Now today we would probably call okolarchy democracy, but for Aristotle, this is the bad form of democracy, and this becomes chaos. But slowly but surely out of chaos will emerge a singular leader who will love his people, and the people will love him, and we start over. So what's the best form of government then, Aristotle? Right? How do we sum this lesson up? And the answer, as he says, is we need a little bit of all the good forms to prevent moving into the bad forms. And as a matter of fact, we're going to see, as we move along in our lessons, this is a principle that makes it into our own constitution. A president, a senate, and a house. So, we will stop here. I hope you all have a wonderful, wonderful afternoon, or whatever time of day it is, and I will see you guys next time.